Hi there, and welcome to Deconstructing Hellbound, an audio walk through a psychological thriller, session two. For the three of you that may have watched the first session, I hope you found it at least enjoyable. And if anyone watched stroke listened to it who was new to writing, hopefully you came away with one or two pertinent points. There's been a slight change to today's session. It was originally going to be about constructing a beat sheet, but I decided that perhaps it was more relevant and important structurally to discuss research briefly about researching your novel. So, yeah, let's get straight into it. So, session two probably won't last any more than 30 minutes because, trust me, nobody really wants to listen to my voice for much longer than that. We will look at researching your novel, why it's important to research your novel, which might seem obvious, but there are certain elements that you may or may not have considered. Certainly, when I started writing Hellbound, the whole issue of research was alien to me, and we will touch on the consequences of that when we get to the final point, which is a comparison exercise. I'm going to show you the original draft of the first chapter of Hellbound, which, apart from Steve Alton, I don't think anyone else has ever seen. I think Kelly might have seen it. Versus the chapter one that was rewritten, that ultimately became the chapter in the book that was published, and there is a vast difference. It's slightly embarrassing to actually be reading what the original draft was. It was so bad. So we're going to look at the before and the after when research had been involved, and the other elements that the research threw up in order to structure and reframe that opening chapter. So yeah, that'll be the first time I've shared it with the world outside of my writing coach. So hopefully you'll get some pointers on what not to do when you're writing your first chapter. So research, it's something that you don't necessarily immediately associate when you begin to start writing a novel, or you develop an interest in wanting to write a novel, whether it's a crime novel or anything, basically. Research isn't the first thing that comes to mind. You've got all the good ideas for story and characters and plot development and twist endings and characterization and what they look like and those kinds of things, how they interact with each other. But research, as in world building, doesn't necessarily come to the forefront of your mind. At the end of the day, you, as the author, you need to immerse yourself in the world of your novel, the world that your story is attempting to describe, because you want to allow the reader to hear those thunderstorms, smell those flowers, smell the dew on the plants, to feel the rain, to smell the fear that someone might have, coming out of their pores right before they're about to be murdered. You want to be able to smell from your descriptions, what the fresh paint smells like, so that they can remember that in their mind, as well as those audio, sensory, visual associations that we have in life. That's the ultimate aim. You're trying to bring your world to life. There's a very good word that was famously used by Richard Donner when he was making Superman the movie, and that was, it's quite difficult to get my tongue around it, verisimilitude. And it means keeping it real. In the case of Superman the movie, it's a film about an alien from another world who can fly and shoot laser beams from his eyes. But Richard Donner kept it as grounded in reality as possible, and the same goes for um, Man of Steel and Batman Superman. When Zack Snyder told the story of Superman, you have to present a world, whether it's on Earth, in space, in an alternate reality, an alternate dimension, a country that you've made up. It has to feel and read as though it's 100% real and genuine. And the way you do that is by adding elements of research and fact to your story, that then allow you to, if there are fictional aspects to it, and fictional by science fiction, etc., um, outer space travel, interstellar travel, those kinds of things, by adding that research and that depth and that evidence that exists in the real world, you can add credibility to your more fantastical aspects of your story. All books, doesn't matter whether it's crime fiction, romance, horror, children's books, they need research to varying degrees. Um, and it's often dictated by how your plot develops, how your characters are going to be created, and how they're going to be motivated in their fictional world that you're developing. The research is dictated by the pacing of your book, where it's going to be set, what it's going to concern, what's the subject matter, those kinds of things. They demand research unless you are exceptionally knowledgeable about the particular the particular subject that you are choosing to write about. As an example, if Tom Clancy had made up the technical aspects of submarines, we probably wouldn't have enjoyed reading and subsequently watching The Hunt for Red October as much. If Steve Alten had just simply followed the work that Peter Benchley had done in Jaws about great white sharks, he wouldn't have quite sold the credibility of a Carcharodon megalodon, this giant prehistoric shark roaming the oceans. Would we have really bought into it and been gripped as, you know, his intention was for us to be? If Peter James faked his way through all the police and criminal investigation aspects of his crime novels, would we still see him as a bestseller for every book that he has? All of these authors and so many more, all, hopefully, this is what you're aspiring to, back up their books, whether it's Meg, that's a fictional book to a certain extent, although history does prove that these giant sharks did exist, but to a certain extent, all the way up to the technical schematics of a submarine and police procedures, they're all imbued with fact, which adds a reality to the story that they're telling, and allows you to, suspend disbelief. It adds a certain amount of credulity to the story that you're trying to tell. So when you say the word research, it doesn't exactly have many people jumping, up and down on their beds with excitement, and it's something that some people enjoy. Academics or otherwise enjoy research, enjoy reading around a subject. I personally do enjoy reading around certain subjects, whether it be, a personal passion of mine is Jack the Ripper, John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, those kinds of things that have certain elements of mystery to them. I like reading around all the subject matter on that particular topic, and then, trying to form my own opinions. So some people do love research. Other people avoid it, as I did when I was studying academically like the plague, because it's the worst kind of homework you could ever be given, to do research. And then all of a sudden you decide that you want to be an author, and then someone tells you that you have to do research, you have to do homework to write a book of an idea that you've got in your head. The two don't necessarily immediately go hand in hand with each other. So it could be someone's idea of dull, boring, and I really don't want to do it. But if you're going to write a novel, whatever the subject matter is going to be, whether it's a psychological thriller or science fiction or romance or crime, at some point you're going to have to embed truth and facts and research into your story. And that just leads to three important questions. If you come away with anything, it's just these questions and a simple sentence for each that you need to remember that will help you with this research, again, irrespective of subject matter. And that's how much, and when. So first, we will deal with how in regards to research. So, how do you go about obtaining this level of research, this depth that you need? Well, any way that you can. At the end of the day, you have to use any means necessary to try and get as much information as you can about whichever topic or aspects of a subject that you think will lend a sense of realism to your story. You need to utilize all the resources that you possibly can. Libraries, the old-fashioned way, going and look at a book, getting a book out, reading, finding the books that are in that particular chosen field. Fellow authors who may have written in that same genre or covered similar subjects, they might have some research that they found beneficial or they can point you in the right direction. You might have a friend of a friend who works in a particular works as a police officer or works in a crime lab or works as a scaffolder or works as an academic, whatever it is, who works abroad as a holiday rep, whatever the subject matter. If you have someone who knows someone or you know someone directly, then use them, ask them questions, speak to them, kind of interview them to get salient points that will add life to your story. Read books, read magazines. I mean, Stephen King swears by to be a better writer, read. Read how other people do it, and not in the sense that you plagiarize what someone's done, but if you read how other people write in a particular genre, you get a feel for how to develop your own style, and you can extrapolate bits from how they establish moods and settings and scenarios and how they describe violence and how they describe passion and everything in between. And you can draw from that if you're well read, and you kind of form it all coalesces into its own version of how you can then put your vision down onto a piece of paper. And of course the internet, which is you don't have to go to a library, you don't have to leave your house, because pretty much everything that you might need research wise is at your fingertips, and 99% of it is free. But there is a place for libraries, because sometimes a piece of text is particularly old or out of print and it just isn't available online. Talking about crime novels, which ultimately is what this series of sessions is relating to, invariably you will either have a scene in a police station or you will be dealing with police officers, detectives, whomever it may be, whether in this country or another. So you need to know what a police station looks like, how you can get there by various forms of transport, how long it takes to get there, what's the roads that you take, what does the decoration look like inside, what does it smell like, how do the people talk, what's the dialect that they use, do they have certain colloquialisms that they use in that part of the country or that part of the world. All of this brings your prison scene to life. And it's vitally important that you don't overburden the reader with detail necessarily, but you have to give enough detail so it looks like you know what you're talking about, because at the end of the day, they want to know that you look like you know what you're talking about. So the how is basically by any means necessary. So how much research should you do about your chosen topic and for your book? You only need to do as much as necessary to show that you know what you're talking about at the end of the day, especially if it's a subject that you're not particularly well versed in. If I was writing a medical book, there are certain aspects that I can call upon from either my nursing background or Kelly's or people that I've met, doctors, consultants, uh, pathologists, biomedical scientists, whomever it might have been I've come into contact with. But I would still have to read around, because even in nursing, if I'm writing about a microbiological event, I don't necessarily know all the workings of a lab and how they get to certain answers that would add a level of realism to my story. So I would have to do some research. So even if you work in a particular area, you might not necessarily be well versed in everything that you need. So you need to do as much research as is necessary to bring your story to life. You've got two goals. You need to convey absolute authority that you know what you are talking about. You need to show you've learned some new stuff, and this is what it is, and this is how it moves your story forward, and this is how it brings that character to life, and this is how it makes that murder look horrifically realistic and something that could happen, something that someone could do. But you don't want to waste too much time on exposition. You don't want too much detail that's kind of going to bog the reader down, but just enough that sells it to the reader, that you sound like you could have been a police officer, you could have worked in a police department, you could have worked in a lab. Stephen King has an excellent book I think he's got a couple of books actually, but he wrote one about writing, and it's one of the best pieces of literature you can buy if you want to become an author. That and also Chris Vogler's book on the hero's journey, which is basically a book that builds upon Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces about the certain elements that are in nearly every book, which again we'll touch upon in a later session. But Stephen King said you may be entranced with what you're learning about the flesh-eating bacteria, the sewer system of New York, or the IQ potential of collie pups. But your readers are probably going to care a lot more about your characters and your story. And basically, he was saying that research is essential, but the research isn't the story. The story is the story. Your story is the story. The research is just to lift it to an extra level that adds realism and depth to everything that's occurring. But readers don't want to know how someone gets a flesh-eating bacteria in nauseating detail. They just want to know that it exists, this is what it does, and oops, he's got it, and how are they going to solve the problem? And then finally we come to when. When should you do your research? Should you do it when you get the first kernel of an idea? And should you start looking on the internet and looking at the library and speaking to people then? Or should you wait till you've got your whole idea plotted out, you've done your beat sheet, you've got your post-it notes, you've done your mind map, however you've done it? Essentially, it depends on the story that you're writing, it depends on you. Fundamentally, the level of research is dictated by the story that you're telling. A romance novel, by default, may well require less research than a book on black holes. So it is entirely up to the story you are wanting to convey and how you wish to convey it. You don't want to saddle the reader, as we mentioned before, with loads of detail and explanations and exposition, because you risk them losing interest. If you keep your opening chapters tight, whether it's a prologue, chapter 1, introduction, whatever it is, if you keep that tight, then readers will often allow you a lot more latitude to go into more detail later on in the book, because you've already got them hooked and they want to find out how it ends. But often, not always, there's always an exception that disproves the rule, but often you start with something gripping or something that entices or encourages the reader to, you're saying to them, come on, come with me. And if you get through this bit, then I guarantee I'll have your attention. And then I can expand on those ideas and hopefully build a picture in your mind of the world I'm trying to create. That's what you want to say to them. So you need research invariably at some point, but you don't want to leave it too late when you've written the story and then you start going back and adding. I mean, everyone always goes back and adds details. An author, just like when you're writing an assignment, you could go back and re-edit and re-edit and re-edit forever till you ended up with a completely different piece of work than you intended. But you never want to sound like you're making stuff up. So you need to find a balance between when and how much research is appropriate. You need to let your characters grow and develop and go where the story takes them, as we mentioned in the first session, and when we'll touch on again with beat sheets, that is the next session. You might have your plot plotted out, and you may know where your characters are going to end up, but the journey that they take to get there might deviate slightly from the plot points that you've developed, the ideas that you've put out, the structure, the map that you have for your story. As long as they end up where they intended to, it's fine if something happens earlier in the story or you move something to later, because as you're writing, things come to mind and you have these characters reacting to certain events that you hadn't necessarily considered when you were just writing a few ideas of how that chapter would go. So they're reacting in a real way, and therefore it dictates where the story will go next because of that unexpected human reality, that human emotion reaction that you hadn't necessarily considered. So always let your characters grow and establish the basics of your story. And then once you're comfortable, then you can start layering in your research and more detail as the story goes on. Basically, use the facts to lift your story and to make your story structurally sound, but not define your story. It's not about research. You're not writing a factually based research book. You're writing an enjoyable book, in this case, a crime novel. Do you want to grip people and thrill people and nauseate people and surprise people? That seems real but isn't bogged down with technical details that aren't necessary. So, now to a comparison between a piece of work that has had no research at all, and I will openly say I did no research at all, to a version of the same chapter that had subsequently been researched to death. Slight bit of context for it. Once I had finished my beat sheet, which is something that Steve Alton encouraged. Again, as I mentioned in the last session, everyone has their own way of developing and plotting out a story. There is no right or wrong way. I was taught to use a beat sheet. It's something that's used a lot by script writers in regards to stories, and some authors do them, but everyone has their own way, and that's absolutely fantastic. I'm not saying this is the only way and never will. It's just what works for me. So I'd done this beat sheet, and Steve was really happy with it. And then I just started writing a chapter, and I think I must have wrote 5 or 6 pages just straight off with this idea in my head. And I will openly admit now, it was absolute crap. And he pretty much told me that it was absolute crap. I've highlighted a few things on the slides. I'm not going to read the whole thing because you will be able to read it yourselves, but I've highlighted a few aspects that really stand out as nauseatingly. I can't think of the word. Up their own arse, basically. I'm trying to show that I can do this writing, this writing shtick, and trying so hard to the point what I vomited on the page was terrible. Harrison Maybrick was the name of my protagonist. Sounds like a rock star. Not as much as I named the serial killer, but Harrison Maybrick's not a good start. I go into a lot of, I go into an inordinate amount of detail that really is a lot of words but says nothing. But then I talk about, but no, he had to go with a question which now portrayed him as a dick who was only interested in how gruesome the execution was going to be. That actually says nothing to move the story forward. It's neither funny, it's neither inventive, and it doesn't really tell you anything about the character apart from he's a bit like a vacuous individual who doesn't really have much to him. I haven't established anything about the character there at all. I made up my screen. I was trying to go for a Facebook-esque individual who, with his friends, had developed, he was a millionaire and he developed this video sharing website that was, so popular in the world and had a market share of around 43% and was the fourth most visited. Who, nobody cares. Nobody cares. The reader wouldn't care. And reading this now, you can probably see that you wouldn't care because it's absolutely terrible. And this was the opening couple of paragraphs of Hellbound originally. Absolutely dire, as I'm sure you'll agree. But I didn't stop there with my terrible, terrible writing and literary elephantitis. There was a third level to this prison that I had in my mind. It held the pièce de résistance of the criminal world, really. You may also expect to see the serial killers who had used new and unusual methods of taking their victims' lives, which range from simple dismemberment to more extreme examples of culinary and gastrological cuisine. What the chuff? I actually feel a bit sick myself actually reading this back. And like I said, apart from Steve Alton and possibly Kelly, no one else has ever seen this, and with good reason. It's like one of those. It's the equivalent of the Star Wars Holiday Special. Not that I'm equating anything I do that's anywhere near George Lucas's magnus opus, but it's just terrible. These individuals were so consumed by hatred towards the light they would do anything to extinguish it, insofar as they had the power to do so. That actually, I don't mind that. That's not too bad. The being that Harrison Maybrick was coming to watch die today was one of those people. He was known only as Erebus. Erebus. It sounds like some sort of cheap deal travel company that you would get from Teesside to London, like Megabus. Erebus is another word for the devil. I was trying to be clever and subtle and appeal to all those intellectual people, and basically I just come across as a really pompous, untalented hack who looks like he's making a story up without actually doing any research at all. And I absolutely had. I had not left my computer or read anything at that point. I just thought, I'm going to completely blow my writing mentor away, and I'm going to write these first few pages of this chapter, and he's going to think it's wonderful. And he literally got back to me and basically said, what the fuck is that? That was essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that was pretty much what he said. So that's a prime example, certainly from my experience, of how something can appear if you don't do any research, if you have no idea what you're talking about. I had no idea what I was talking about. I was just using the things that I'd heard and read and seen in regards to, crime films, other crime books, what people might expect to read in a crime book. I had read crime thrillers, but I hadn't really read them outside of anything for enjoyment, so I had no literary depths to plumb to try and develop how I think a crime novel should be written. I just wrote one how I think it should be written, not actually with any idea how one should be written. That's how something looks without research. It's imperative as a writer that you know what you're talking about, and it's imperative the readers are confident that you know what you're talking about. For someone like me who is easily distracted, research can be a less obvious version of checking your email or going on Facebook if that's what you do. I was always known at school for being easily distracted. Don't sit David near any other people. Don't sit him near the window because he'll look and daydream. So, it can be to your detriment if you're easily distracted. Oh, because you research, there'll be a link to something else and it'll take you off in a completely different direction. But you have to show the readers you know what you're talking about. When I started writing the opening pages of Hellbound, I had no idea what I was talking about. I'd plotted out a story, and the kernels of a good story were there somewhere, but they were hidden under loads of junk, basically. So I revised my beat sheet and I rewrote the chapter. It didn't just end up on the page literally as this, as my fellow authors know. You do a lot of fiddling and twiddling. This actually wasn't the original first edition of Hellbound. I added more to it when its second edition was released, because after a number of years, there was things that I was told I had to take out that I always liked. As many authors will know, when you have to edit, it was famously said, was it Stephen King, who said about it's like ostracizing a child. You have to get rid of one of your siblings. You have to get rid of parts of characters or plot points that you love, and it's really, really difficult. So I felt I'd earned, after a few years and having written 4-5 books by then, that I could go back and insert these certain elements and descriptions and plot points that I'd liked that I was told to take out, because for a first book it wasn't something that someone could indulge in. But for me, I felt I'd earned the right to be a little bit self-indulgent, but only slightly, for my own benefit. It doesn't mean that anyone else will think it's any good if they didn't think it was good before. But on the page there, that's an example of how I changed the beginning of Hellbound. And again, was one of the revisions that I added in on the second edition. But I wanted to add a sense of unease about the island. I'm not talking about anything to do with serial killers. I'm not talking about anything to do with a prison yet in that first paragraph. I'm just trying to set the scene that there was a lot of history where this prison is, and it's not a particularly pleasant place or somewhere that makes you feel particularly comfortable, to try and instill that sense of unease from the get go. And then there was a little bit in between, but then further down that opening section, I talk about the prison in succinctly, but with detail, rather than the elaborate verbal vomit that I'd done on the original draft, where I was talking about something that I had no idea what I was talking about. By this point, I had been instructed very strongly to learn about the death penalty, to learn about maximum security prisons, to learn about the island that I was setting it on, which seems obvious now, and of course you would. It's disrespectful to try and write about somewhere that you have no idea, you know nothing about it at all. And you're doing it an injustice not only to the people and the island's history, but also to your readers. So I learned about the Dingle Peninsula. It's a very real place. In Ireland, in the Blasket Islands, I just plonked a prison on it. Of course, a prison doesn't exist on the Blasket Islands. The island that I picked, they filmed Ryan's Daughter, but it's fiction. So hey, you know, the Avengers didn't destroy half of New York, but we buy it because, you know, suspension of disbelief. We're just enjoying it. So a little bit further into the opening section, I wanted to again build on that sense of unease about how the Irish translation for the island works out as the dead man, all based in fact. I'd done the research. I found out what the Irish meant. Um, I found out where it was in regards to it's in the westerly point of Ireland. I actually got a map and looked to see where it was. And when it came to the prison, Absalom, it's not the name of a real prison, but there are supermax prisons that exist in the world, and they are very real. So I did a lot of research into supermax prisons. What did they look like? It's very difficult to get footage. There is a little bit of footage on the internet, on YouTube, about what they look like inside, but given their moniker of supermax prisons, there's not a lot of detail. But there is quite a bit of written detail in regards to newspaper articles and papers that have been written on inmates there. So I was able to get a wealth of information about what it was like being in a supermax prison as a prisoner, and also what to expect from one. And the description is pretty much verbatim accurate in regards to how small and confined and isolated and lonely and punishing it is to be in a cell in a supermax prison, and that the inmates have very, very little offered to them by way of recreation, because it's felt that if you commit a crime that warrants being incarcerated in a supermax prison, you're not necessarily going to be given a lot to pass the time other than think about what you've done. Also, by that, and by describing succinctly, I hope, but with enough detail to sell what the prison was like, you could feel and imagine that oppressive atmosphere which fed on and led on naturally from the sense of unease that I was trying to introduce in the chapter. Basically, upon reading it, again, yourselves, you can see a vast difference between the original draft and what it subsequently ended up becoming. I'm in no way saying that either version is great. It's just apparent that the first version is terrible. But hopefully that gives an idea to anyone who is starting their way into writing their book, or is, has this idea that they really, really want to put down on paper. I can't stress the importance of research enough, because it really, really does make the difference between a story we all think our stories are good. Of course we do. Nobody sets out to tell a bad story or write a bad book, just like nobody sets out to make a bad film. But it's important that you imbue it with as much realism as possible in varying levels of detail to sell your story and elevate it beyond something that's just a vacuum filled bunch of words on the screen or on paper, and that research will actually add realism to it so you can form those pictures in your mind. The first version that I did, you couldn't really form any pictures in your mind, I don't think. I like to think that subsequently there was more on offer that could allow the reader to mentally form those pictures of what it would be like to be an inmate in a supermax prison in, a very few paragraphs. And that is it for session 2 of Deconstructing Hellbound, which was all about research again. Hopefully you may have picked up 1 or 2 bits and pieces that you will find useful. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are taking those first steps into being an author, I can't stress how important research is to your story. The level of research can only be identified by yourself, the author, and the depth that you go into in that research is dictated by your story ultimately. But I cannot stress again enough: research, research, research to sell and elevate your novel to something special, and that will really pull readers into the world you're creating. The next session next week will be on beat sheets. Again, I shuffled the schedule about a little bit, so we will look at constructing a beat sheet again, just how I was taught and how to construct the brief ideas that your story is going to revolve around, and how you can then kind of develop and fill that out, add meat to the bones, so to speak, because ultimately your beat sheet or your ideas for a story are that skeleton, and then you have to build upon it and add more to it as you go along. And sometimes you surprise yourself by what comes to mind. So yes, session 3, constructing a beat sheet. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Deconstructing Hellbound, and I'll speak to you later. Bye.